I want to make this video today to talk very specifically about what I've learned regarding digital spaces. And digital spaces are quite unique from physical spaces. And I think I've noticed a lot more people have been interested specifically in this subject, and especially around the content that I've been making around this subject as people experiment more and more with these things and figure it out. So as you figure it out, let me give you kind of the map of these things as I see it and as I've kind of discovered it as I go through it. And up front, kind of the biggest conceptualization that you need to get into your head that I kind of frame this within up front is that like geometry and the way that you look at it is not the world that you envision it to be and that we've uh, envisioned it to be, right? So we base geometry off of Euclidean space. Euclid wrote the book literally on geometry, right? And so within that, I guess we make certain assumptions, and then just inherent assumptions. And I mean, a big assumption that I have made my entire life, I've just never thought about it. It's an assumption because you don't think about it. Is that you assume that Euclidean space models like actual physics, right? Like actual environments. But Euclidean space is an outlier when it comes to digital space. And it's so why are we just now figuring these things out would be the next question within that I would ask myself, right? And then so the reason why that is because this is hard to visualize. It's extremely hard to visualize, and it's extremely hard to prove and go through mathematically. Like it's challenging, time-consuming overall, etc. Right? And we are just in the era where all of that aligns, where I can do that easily. Like I don't have to expend my own energy to crunch the equations to prove this to you. I offloaded it all to AI, and it did it. And so here we are now, right? And then so now I can prove it to you mathematically through physics, etc. And then so here we go. And then so what I have learned throughout these insights is that the bottom line to me is that you have to frame and think of Euclidean space as the imaginary space. So we have let's say hyperbolic space, fractal space, and Euclidean space. These three spaces, right? And the difference being very simplistically that Euclidean space is 2D, hyperbolic space is 3D, and fractal space is below 2D. We'll call it that. And so within that realm, Euclidean space, the one that models, but it doesn't. So Euclidean space doesn't just model 2D. That's just clean, right? Euclidean space also has another feature to it, which is that it has no boundaries. Euclidean space is infinite space. Like if you were to imagine in space as infinity, that would be Euclidean space, and that's the problem. Space is not infinity, and then so. The way that you shape space influences the physics of the space. It goes down to relativistic physics and everything that we know about physics overall, right? And then so if you're shaping an imaginary space as infinity, it turns out that also impacts physics, right? It doesn't matter if the space is physical or digital, it still inherits the laws of physics regarding that space. And then so if you're designing an infinity space, it's not going to have relativistic physics because there's no curvature in the space, just flat out. And then so going into hyperbolic space, where it's 3D space where we're curving the space. And that's a big thing within this too, right? It's curvature. Hyperbolic space is much closer to reality. And then within this, that's where you get like actual dynamics, and if you want to measure different relationships in real world terms, that's where you would go. If you are looking to accelerate your experiments in any way, then you look towards fractal space, and then knowing these kind of give you really key insights, right? So to me, since I mapped this out, I go to Euclidean space maybe 10% of the time. Like there's useful use cases for when you just want to map something out quickly, that's Euclidean space. Where you want to model something real world, that's hyperbolic space. Where I want to play around with experiments and I want to make scenarios that wouldn't be like actual, but I want to like speed up the experiment at fractal space, right? Like I want like extreme conditions, and then that's where I go within that. And then so why this is important is, again, I can't frame this enough, is that these framing of these spaces directly impacts the physics of these spaces. So within Euclidean space, and I can test this and I'll prove this to anyone who wants to, within Euclidean spaces, there's no natural clustering forces, right? So meaning that if you disperse agents, they'll disperse out evenly, completely even, right? And no clustering effect will impact that whatsoever. There's no dials that you can shift within Euclidean space. Within hyperbolic space, you have clustering effects. Agents will naturally come together. Objects will naturally cluster together because of gravity. And the gravity that exists within the hyperbolic space will make those agents compress like it does in our real world. And that's how agents and planets are formed and our universe is formed, right? Is because of this clustering effect. And then within quantum space or within fractal space, that's where you get into quantum dimensions. And then it's important to note within this, right? So I'm going to state one more thing within this that you should wrap your brain around. That's going to be hard for to wrap their brain around. But so fractal space is I'll call it the home of quantum dynamics, meaning that essentially you can dial down. These are all dials, right? And that's the big thing to mention within this, and it's important to know that it's not a transition, right? You don't all of a sudden go from hyperbolic to Euclidean space or from hyperbolic to fractal space. It's a slow transition. Like, so for example, to go from hyperbolic to fractal space, it's generally in the range of like 2.41 to 2.52 dimensions, flat out, right? And you just turn that dial. And then as you turn the dial, you can see you start, okay, this is the point where you open the door to relativistic physics within the environment. You can see that occur, like 2.41 dimensions, right? And then it's really cool to go through and see it. But it's a dial. Again, not on off, right? So it blends at 2.41 dimensions. Like you're still really into like you're opening the door for relativistic physics, and then by 2.50 you're like the door is shut for quantum mechanics, and it's like really kind of cool how quickly that door opens and shuts within that, right? So just pointing that out as well. But so this last thing that I want to get to before we move up within this is that so within quantum mechanics, essentially, the difference between quantum mechanics and relativistic physics in these terms is that quantum mechanics is the realm of chaos, right? Of chaos theory, where things are discrete, meaning that they're not linear, and they're not linear action. And then so within that and chaos, right? You think that your brain goes towards that chaos, but the important thing to mention is that fractal space and this chaos space is more stabilizing than either of these two spaces, flat out. If you want a stable environment for your agents, you want a stable environment to test in, a stable digital test jar, fractal space where chaos theory lives is where you want it to be. Chaos theory is stabilizing overall. But here's the interesting thing within that, right? Like not 100% stabilizing. Like if you want it to be, if you want like a medical stabilization, right? I'll frame it in that terms. Like where we need zero deviation, then fractal space isn't the best space. You're going to like tweak hyperbolic space to get to where you want to go, right? Because fractal space is going to have deviations and jumps, like it's going to be a wave, right? But that wave is going to be very stable across a long period of time. And then so that's how that works out. And then so kind of all of the features that I've learned so far through digital space and mapping this out, taking this to the next level, right? So we've talked about the spaces themselves. How do objects operate within these spaces? And then so there's a few ways and features of the objects within these spaces. First of all, the geometric foundations. You have within the geometric foundations cubes. I have found when it comes to clustering behaviors overall, nothing beats cube except for negative space cube. And then so this introduces, probably already up front, another concept that is going to kind of blow your mind immediately. There's a few that I'm going to go through, right? But so negative space cubes is just exactly what you think of, right? So if you have a cube and then all of the dimensions of the cube and all of the dimensions of the cube are within positive space and they're positive dimensions and they're positive lines, this is digital space, right? So you can have a mirror opposite of that. Like you can have a cube that exists in negative space with negative curvature, with negative lines, etc. Like whatever you want, right? And then so you can connect those two cubes together as well. But so within that, just highlighting like if you want the ultimate space to play within, like I want my agents to cluster like the most. It's not fractal space. It's not any weird shapes. Like I've tried like all the weird shapes, right? It's a cube, and it's a cube in negative hyperbolic space. Number one, boom, there you go. Answer solved, right? And then so next we go into curvature dynamics, and then curvature dynamics are just very simply the curvature of space, bending the space itself, right? And then so within that you can have positive curvature, meaning bending it this way, or negative curvature, like bending it this way, right? And then which way that you bend the curvature of the space impacts very specifically the agent behavior within that space, as well as the energy and entropy behaviors within that space, right? So bending it within what we operate within hyperbolic space, it amplifies clustering and it drives agent flow. Whereas within a positive curvature space, a spherical space, it dampens chaos and its agents spread more uniformly. And then so within this, another interesting thing to note within this, right, is that you can have geometric properties that combine, right? So in this instance, in this real world instance, we operate and we live in a universe that is hyperbolic space and live on a planet that is spherical space. And then so if we were looking at these in digital terms, that would definitively have an influence on that, right? Like it wouldn't just be hyperbolic space by itself and spherical space by itself. We would have to examine and understand that relationship and that dynamic very specifically between the hyperbolic and the spherical space together. And then that together relationship is what we would map create our map off of, right? And then so next thing that we go into is dimensional boundaries. And then within that we have high dimensions and low dimensions. Very specifically, so within a hyperbolic space, again, hyperbolic space is generally speaking, agents will cluster in hyperbolic space. They'll come together, right? Except for you can stack dimensions and you can start getting very high as far as stacking dimensions. So let's say that we get up to 100 dimensions. At that point, the stacking dimensions and the fact that we've stacked 100 dimensions, that starts taking precedent over the environment itself. So we've stacked enough dimensions, enough boxes on top of each other that it's like the physics of that are finally like, okay, we cave, and the physics of these 100 boxes and these 100 universes essentially stacked on top of each other are going to outweigh the physics of the hyperbolic structure there. And then so then the physics of the high dimensional spaces then come into account. And then so what that means is that you get less clustering, less energy dispersion, less entropy dispersion. All of the general impacts that you would get from like hyperbolic or negative curve space tend to get dampened within that same space for high dimensions. And there's use cases, like there's scenarios where you would want to test all these things, right? That's where you come about them and how I've come about them. And then so the opposite is true as well, right? So lower dimensions tend to increase stability, increase energy flow, increase entropy, increase agent clustering, everything that you want, right? And then so you have, and then you always know that you can dial that dial down to 1. And then so let's say that you run an experiment and then you're in high dimensional space, 3-dimensional space would be the default, right? And then so you run and then you're running into issues like your agents aren't clustering enough, you don't have enough energy in the environment. You can dial the dial down, 2.5. You're going to get some better results out of that. You're going to get more stability in your environment out of that by just dialing that dial down. And then you can dial it down to 1.0. If you dial it down to 0.99 from 1.0, it's going to break. But and then as you get closer to 1.0, you're going to start having more interactions that you don't want. So generally, you're going to want to stay above 2.0. But you do know, like in the back of your mind, emergency scenario, you can crank that dial down to 1. And then so within this, it says, I think going to be this next and the last, hopefully the last concept within this that completely blows your mind. But this is so frame this scenario in your head, right? So I look at these digital spaces and these digital environments as jars. So let's take like hyperbolic space, right? And we'll take a cube in hyperbolic space. Essentially, what we're doing is we're creating a digital jar, and then our digital jar lives in a hyperbolic space environment, and then the actual structure of the jar is a cube, and then so that is the full extent of the environment, right? Anything outside of the cube then is not a part of the environment. And that's very important within this next concept that we'll introduce. So within that, I can introduce external pumps to the environment, very specifically entropy and energy pumps. And then so if I have, and I'm testing in my environment, and then I have too much or too little energy in my environment, I can just directly connect an energy pump to that cube, and then it's going to pump in, and I set the rules of the pump, right? So whatever the rules I set, and then that pump will pump in energy into the environment according to the rules, and the environment will take it in, and it will work, and it will function to infinity, right? Like, so if you've ever played like SimCity or like city builder simulations, like all of that, right? Like generally speaking, like you'll have like a river or a body of water that just comes into the environment, right? Like a road, railroad tracks. It's just like from the next town off the screen, bro. They just come in. Like all the travelers, they I don't know, they come in from off the map. That's how these energy and these entropy pumps work. It's just, I don't know, just off the map. They just work, and it works because it's digital space, right? It's use your imagination, and that's what I love about this, right? Like this is imaginary space. All of this is imaginary, so it's do whatever you want in imaginary space. And then so that leads us lastly to these key relationships that I've discovered within this. And then so within these key relationships, what I've noticed is that negative space actually induces clustering more. You would think it's the opposite, but nope. If you want to increase clustering, put the agents in a negative space. Curvature agents and gradients directly impact not only agent flow, entropy flow, and energy flow, meaning that the curvature of the space itself is a dial. I look at all of these things as dials, right? Entropy is a dial, energy is a dial, the environment shape is a dial, the curvature of the environment is a dial, and then the curvature of the environment itself allows me to dial like 4 dials at once. And then so you have to, like, it's structures upon structures, right? And then the last thing to leave you with is that geometry and entropy stabilization are very related. Exactly as I was mentioning there, that you can control these environments overall, right? So within, let's say, 3D hyperbolic space, it's a general rule according to the rules of relativity that entropy is going to increase within that environment over time, right? That's just a general rule of relativity. So you put a cube in there, and then you put environments in that environment. Over time, entropy is going to increase. But if I jack in an entropy pump into that environment, or an energy pump, and I start pumping energy into that environment, it's from outside, it's going to stabilize that environment, right? And that's not violating the laws of physics because of the energy pump. The energy pump's just pumping in energy, and it's not like, it's not a part of the environment. The physics of the energy pump, how it's doing that, I don't. It's just doing it, right? Because it's digital, but It doesn't, like, the rules of why it's doing it don't matter in the environment. It's so unlimited energy, bro. And there you go. And it's kind of cool to frame it in that sense, right? It's freeing to operate within this space. It doesn't operate, it's again, look at these as jars, right? So you create an environment, a digital jar, and then whatever operates within that jar is the physics of the jar. Whatever operates outside of the jar doesn't matter. Like, it's just there. And then whatever rules that you're programming into it, whether it's an entropy pump, an energy pump, a curvature pump, like something that I haven't invented that I can't even think of or fathom, as long as it's existing outside of the environment, it's not going to impact the physics of the environment, specifically unless it impacts the physics of the environment, like an energy or an entropy pump. Pretty cool, huh? So if you like this type of content, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.